The United States is illegally occupying Syria, and Syria is now begging the United Nations to please do something about it. Syrian journalist Kevork Almassian joins us to discuss. So, thank you for joining me. Can you remind our audience how and why the United States is even there in the first place before we get to this bit of news?
Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be on your show always, like always. Actually, the United States interference in Syria goes back to the 80s and the 70s. They tried to do the coup d'etats in Syria multiple times during the 80s by supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, but most famously because during the era of social media that everybody is speaking about the Syrian case, it started in 2011. They tried to overthrow the government through proxies, and most of them were radical Islamists. So if you believe that the attacks on 9/11 were carried out by Al-Qaeda, if you believe so, the United States was directly supporting these jihadists on the ground in Syria in order to occupy certain areas, and these areas were rich of fuel, oil, and gas fields. And the proof and evidence for that is in 2012, the Defense Intelligence Agency of the United States, they prepared an investigation and a report, and they sent it to Barack Obama when he was a president. And they warned him that the active forces on the ground in Syria who are fighting against President Assad and the Syrian army are the Al-Qaeda affiliates. And they specifically mention eastern part of Syria, which means in Deir ez-Zor and on the borders with Iraq. And they say the
Are
Iraqi
you talking about al-Nusra
yeah,
here?
yes,
That faction?
yes,
Yeah.
and the report specifies and says that the Iraqi branch of Al Qaeda, they are active on the borders and they are infiltrating the borders, and they are also supporting the Syrian branch of Al Qaeda there. So whether when the American side wants to send weapons and ammunition, they're going to end up in the hands of these terrorists. And these terrorists, they occupied the oil and gas fields for a very long time, since 2012 and 2013. And when the Syrian army launched a major military offensive against them, this was in 2018 with the support of Russia and Iran. And they pushed back the ISIS terrorists because Al-Qaeda later, they had a split between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. The leaders were fighting, so there was a split, and ISIS occupied this area in 2015. The Syrian army managed to push back ISIS from the deserts, and when the Americans saw that the Syrian and the Russian and the Iranian side, they were going to crush ISIS, they have created a new force on the ground called Syrian Democratic Forces. The Syrian Democratic Forces are mostly YPG and the PKK forces, and they're around 60,000 fighters. And these fighters, they managed to occupy the oil and gas fields on the eastern shore of the Euphrates. If you allow me, I will show the map of control over Syria, and I will, just for the audience to know how the Syrian geography looks like today. This is the entire Syrian geography. The red one is controlled by the Syrian army, and the yellow one is controlled by the American forces, and also this green side is occupied by the American forces. If we zoom in just a little bit, we will see that all these areas are full of gas and oil fields. And those are the areas that the American forces are stationed, and they are looting the oil of Syria. Actually, they're extracting it, and then they are sending it to Iraq. And from Iraq, it is going to other countries. And the United States is basically also financing its stay in Syria through the revenues of the oil fields. But most also famously, this area, the green area, is also occupied by the United States because the US forces, they want to block any trade route and trade activity between Syria and its neighboring countries. This is the most important border crossing of Syria to do trade with Jordan and Iraq. And as you can see, the United States is blocking Syria not to do business in its neighboring countries through this border crossing, and also looting and occupying the oil fields on the eastern shore of the Euphrates, where it is clear on this yellow side.
Right. In fact, Stephen Gowans, in his great book, Washington's Long War on Syria, says that Syria comparatively doesn't have as much oil as its neighbors. So that's like a perk for the United States. What they really are interested in is blocking Arab nationalism. And in fact, they've been doing this since Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, was in power. So that is not new. Would you agree with that?
Actually, that's one of the reasons why the United States has been targeting Syria. It's the pan-Arabism of Syria, which is a model of uniting the Arabic countries, not on ethnic lines, but rather on the interest lines. And what is the interest of the Arabic countries is to have a sovereign countries, is to have economic integration, and also to liberate their natural resources to keep it for themselves. And this was the project also by Jamal Abdel Nasser, Hafiz al-Assad, and later also Libyan leader Gaddafi, President Bashar al-Assad, and you can see all these leaders were targeted.
And Saddam Hussein
Yeah,
also
yeah. So
was interested
the
in
problem
that. Yes.
the problem with Saddam Hussein was that he came to power in the late 70s and early 80s with the support of the CIA, so that he fights against I would say Iran. But later, when he felt that he has a big power in the region because he considered this war as a victory for himself, he started to go against the American interest, and that's when the Americans intervened and they tried to crush Saddam Hussein at the beginning of the 90s when he invaded especially Kuwait. Although the American ambassador in Iraq back then, she said she told Saddam that they're not going to do anything if Saddam invades Kuwait. So basically, they trapped him to go into Kuwait, and when he invaded Kuwait, the Americans came and bombed him in Iraq. I want to just mention one thing, if you allow me.
It's not a good story of friendship.
Yeah.
Yes.
I would just mention one more thing. Dana Stroll, she is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East now under the Biden administration. 2 years ago, she has a famous statements in a panel about the Syrian war. She says, the United States owns, in her own words, the United States owns 1/3 of Syria, and the United States owns Syria's carbohydrates, and the United States owns Syria's food basket. And she says this.
Okay.
She literally mentions these words, and she says the United States owns these carbohydrates and the food basket of Syria in order to have a leverage over the outcome of the Syrian war in a way that it serves the interests of the United States.
The United States still had compelling forms of leverage on the table to shape an outcome that was more conducive and protective of U.S. interests. And we identified 4. So the first one was the 1/3 of Syrian territory that was owned via the U.S. military with its local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces. Now, this was a light footprint on the U.S. military, only about 1,000 troops over the course of the Syria Study Group's report, and then the tens of thousands of forces, both Kurdish and Arab, under the Syrian Democratic Forces. And that 1/3 of Syria is the resource-rich, it's the economic powerhouse of Syria. So where the hydrocarbons are, which obviously is very much in the public debate here in Washington these days, as well as the agricultural powerhouse. But we argued that it wasn't just about this 1/3 of Syrian territory that the U.S. military and our military presence owned, both to fight ISIS and also as leverage for affecting the overall political process for the broader Syrian conflict. The rest of Syria, though, is rubble. And what the Russians want and what Assad wants is economic reconstruction. And that is something that the United States can basically hold a card on via the international financial institutions and our cooperation with the Europeans. So we argued that absent behavioral changes by the Assad regime, we should hold the line on preventing reconstruction aid and technical expertise from going back into Syria.
They do not mention...
Well, that's news to me as an American. Didn't know that. Can my passport take me there?
Actually, if you want to go to Syria now as a journalist, as an American journalist or any foreign journalist, if you have friendly opinions about the United States forces in Syria, they would allow you to go near even the oil fields where the American forces are located, and then you are forced, of course, according to an agreement with the U.S. Defense Ministry, to post tweets on X and say that the Americans are, quote, guarding the Syrian oil fields in order to block ISIS from having an access to the fuel of Syria. But let me remind everyone what ISIS did with the Syrian oil. ISIS stole the Syrian oil with hundreds of barrels per day, probably thousands, and they were these tankers, they were taking the fuel of Syria. They were marching to Turkey, and there's satellite imagery for that, with thousands of them marching to Turkey, which is a NATO country. And the son of Erdogan, Bilal, he was the person in charge of getting the oil and giving the revenues to ISIS. So ISIS became a state and they were just an organization, but then they declared themselves as a state because they had an economic independence. And that happened thanks to a NATO country. And let's remember that the United States has one of the biggest military bases outside the United States. It's in Turkey, it's in Incirlik, and this was happening all under the watch and the satellite imagery of the United States. They did nothing. And then when the Russians intervened, the first thing they did, they cut this lifeline of ISIS, which was taking the oil of Syria to Turkey and getting back dollars. But what happened afterwards? The United States just replaced ISIS with something called the Syrian Democratic Forces. So it's still the same. Just the looters are different now, and the revenues of this oil aren't going to the people's benefit in Syria. And Syria estimates the losses over $100 billion. $100 billion, you can reconstruct half the damage that happened to the cities and the governorates of Syria in the past 12 years.
Yes, well, let's put a fine point on that because what they're demanding this week is they're demanding a return of the land that the United States occupies and the oil and gas fields of the Syrian state. They're also saying that the U.S. has stolen, the number they put is $115.2 billion worth of oil at an average of 150,000 barrels per day.
Yes.
So the big question here is, what is the United Nations going to do about this? And I think it's a good time to remind our audience that last year when UN Deputy Spokesperson General Farhan Haq was asked about this, he was very confused when Chinese journalist Denzi Zhu asked. He was like, I don't know, not the same. It was an amazing piece of video.
Yes, Deji.
Couple of questions on Syria. Yesterday, there's a drone attack to a U.S. base in northeast Syria, which resulted in one death and 6 injured. After that, U.S. launched a airstrike, also killed 11 people in Syria. Any reaction from the Secretary General on this incident?
Oh, well, of course, we continue to be worried about all of the continuing tensions, and we are trying to see what can be done to lower the tensions from different forces in Syria, and we'll continue with those efforts.
Do you not to urge everybody to respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria?
Well, of course, that's a given, and obviously it's important that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syria is respected. At the same time, you're aware of the complexity of the situation of foreign forces, but we call for them to exercise restraint.
But do you think the presence of the U.S. military in Syria is illegal or not?
That's not an issue that we're dealing with at this stage. There's been a war.
But is that because it sounds very familiar. This week we talk a lot about the UN Charter, the international law, and relative resolutions. But it sounds to me a foreign military-based presence in another country without invitation sounds like something else to me. You know.
I'll leave your analysis to you. There's at this stage.
What's the difference between Syria, the situation in Syria, and the situation in Ukraine?
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria, and so I don't have a. It's not a parallel situation.
You're
to some of the
sure
others.
there's no U.S. military personnel?
I believe there's military activity.
Yeah.
But in terms of a ground presence in Syria, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, 5 U.S. service members were injured in that attack. If there were no U.S. service members in Syria, how could they got injured? That's weird, right? Should I ask you about that? And by the way, if you're talking about the resolution, the international law, here is the resolution from Security Council 2254, I believe. It says in its PA paragraph, reaffirming its strong commitment to the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of the Syrian Arab Republic, and to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations.
Yes, I'm aware of that, and as you see, that is accepted by the members of the Security Council itself.
Yeah, so again, back to my question, is that illegal to have presence in Syria for the U.S. base? According to the relevant resolution. that I just read out.
Yes, the relevant resolution does call for that, and we call on all countries to respect that. I wouldn't go beyond that at this stage.
So, are they going to play that game again, do you think?
Breaking news, breaking news. The United Nations is not going to do anything in this regard. And they're not going to act decisively against the United States because the United States has a strong influence over the international body. And we can see how biased the United Nations has become. And even institutions that are affiliated with the United Nations, such as the OPCW recently. And the example that you mentioned is a crystal clear example that the journalist Chu, which I personally interviewed him, he resides in New York City. He's a very smart journalist, and he trapped the spokesperson for the UN in this regard. And the United Nations, they refuse to acknowledge that there are American forces in Syria from the first place. They refuse to acknowledge that there are occupation forces, because if the United Nations acknowledges that there are U.S. forces in Syria, the first question mark will come: what's the legitimacy of the U.S. forces in Syria? Because according to the Syrian constitution and also international law, those forces their presence is illegal, because the Syrian government didn't ask the United States to come and help Syria. There is no official invitation from the Syrian parliament or from the Syrian government to the United States to come. And secondly, there is no mandate from the UN Security Council for the Americans to come to Syria to guard our oil fields and to protect us from any danger. Because in my estimates as a Syrian journalist, if the US forces leave Syria now, the fractions of the ISIS that are left in Syria, they will be completely destroyed. But all these ISIS cells, if we remember the map of control over Syria, they are operating on the peripheries of the US forces sites in Syria, and they are waging attacks only against the Syrian army. There is no attack against the American forces in Syria by ISIS. They are only against the Syrian forces. And in the past 3 months, Syria lost over 60 Syrian soldiers because the ISIS cells were committing attacks on the highways where the Syrian army is moving, and they were murdering them in a most merciless way. And these imageries and this news aren't coming to the mainstream media, of course, because if they show it and if they tell the people what's happening in Syria, the people will understand that the presence of the US forces in Syria is not to fight terrorism, but to make sure that these remaining cells of ISIS remain in the Syrian deserts, because the Syrian desert is a very difficult place to fight and to conquer from the Syrian army side. And in order for them to continue this war of attrition against the Syrian side, instead of Syrian side focusing on the American forces. And Dana Struhl's statement in this regard is quite clear. She never says that we are there to fight terrorism. She says we are there to own the Syrian carbohydrates and to own Syria's food basket in order to influence the outcome of the Syrian war. So they would strike a deal with Syria and tell them, okay, if you want to withdraw from Syria, you have to do A, B, C, D, and then we can withdraw from Syria, which is, in my opinion, blackmailing and also terrorizing, because you're terrorizing the people by telling them you're going to freeze in the winter because you don't have a fuel. You're going to have a huge inflation. You're not going to be able to reconstruct your country because you resisted this regime change war project in Syria. And I would call this an act of terrorism.
Okay, I have one more question, and it's not a simple one, but we'll do our best. Then why has Israel stepped up attacks on Syria, and why are they not mentioned in this letter to the United Nations?
The Israeli side was heavily involved in the Syrian war from the beginning. There are even reports from the Wall Street Journal revealing the role of Israel in giving cash to Al-Qaeda terrorists near the borders with Al-Golan Heights, which is occupied by Israel, and secondly, giving them medical treatment in the Golan Heights hospitals, which means practically now inside Israel. When the ex-Mossad chief of Mossad was asked on Al Jazeera, how is it possible for Israel to give aid to Al-Qaeda? He said, we always have to treat our enemies with in a humane way. And he says, as far as he recalls, Al-Qaeda never attacked Israel before. This is what he says. But then he was asked, okay, then would you give a medical treatment to Hezbollah fighters in Lebanon if they were injured? He says no, because Hezbollah has conducted attacks against Israel. So he contradicted himself when it comes to this humanitarian aspect. But after 2018, when Syria liberated the borders between the Golan Heights and Syria, the current Syria, Israel started to increase its aerial bombing of Syria because their proxies were defeated on the ground in Syria. And the Israeli main concern is Syria's military capabilities. They don't want the Syrian army to restore its military might. Because they want always to keep Syria destabilized and weak, because a strong Syria always means that the resistance groups against Israel to liberate the occupied territories by Israel, according to every UN Security Council resolution, Syria is giving aid to these groups against Israel. So Israel wants to keep Syria weak and fragmented so that Syria would stay busy always in its internal infighting instead of supporting any group that is trying to liberate the territories occupied by Israel today. So I would say, I would quote the ex-Israeli defense minister, I think his name is Moshe Ya'alon, who says that he prefers ISIS over Syria and Iran. And he prefers ISIS to win this war over Syria and Iran because he says ISIS is a weak organization compared to Syria and Iran, who are organized and they could pose a threat on the security of Israel. But let's remember, the security of Israel here means territories occupied by Israel. This is East Jerusalem, West Bank, the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, Shab'a Farms, all these areas that Israel occupies, they should withdraw from them. So according to international law, if you use force against the Israeli occupation forces on Arabic territories occupied by Israel, it is permissible under international law. So this is what he means when he mentions the security of Israel. Security of Israel is inside the territories of Israel and not on Arabic territories.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. And it's interesting to see the two different forces that are that Syria is fighting then, because it doesn't, because they have Israel on the one hand and then the United States as an occupier. So thank you for breaking that down for us. I really appreciate it. It's always a pleasure. Where can we find you if we want to follow more of your analysis?
Thank you very much, first of all, for having me again. Your followers can find my work on YouTube called Syriana Analysis, and also on Twitter, Kevork Almassian. I'm mostly active on these two platforms recently.
Fantastic. Thank you again.
Thank you.